On this episode of The Blurb, a book that's like North by Northwest meets Stranger Things. Welcome to The Blurb. I'm your host, Glenn Porzig. Be sure to check out theblurb.tv for show notes and handy links. This episode is brought to you by Graphic Entertainment. Discover the supernatural thriller series Darkness Unbound, free with Kindle Unlimited at graphicentertainment.com/Darkness Unbound. Stephen Paul Sayers is a college professor and international best-selling author of supernatural thriller and horror fiction. His debut novel, A Taker of Morrows, was published by Hydra Publications in June 2018, followed by the second book in the Caretakers series, The Soul Dweller, in November of 2018. His short fiction has appeared in Unfading Daydream and Well Versed. As a research scientist, Stephen yields to the left-brain world of data analysis and statistics by day, but releases the demons in his slightly twisted right brain by night. It gets strange around dusk when neither side is fully in control. He makes his home in Columbia, Missouri, and Plymouth, Massachusetts, not far from the Cape Cod locations he writes about in the Caretakers novels. Throughout his journey, he has accumulated 5 guitars, 4 herniated discs, 3 academic degrees, 2 dogs, and 1 wife, son, and daughter, but not in that order. I'd like to welcome author Stephen Paul Sayers to The Blurb.
Thanks, Glenn. Glad to be here.
All right, we're glad to have you. And as you know, this is The Blurb, so we jump right into you reading the blurb from your book. So,
okay. All right, here goes. R.G. Granville has his whole life in front of him, but only 24 hours to live it. Beyond life's boundaries, an enduring battle between good and evil determines the fate of earthly souls. Here, caretakers guard and protect against the evil and vengeful jumpers who slip back and forth between worlds to prey on the living. For one man, news of his impending demise sets off a deadly chain of events fueled by a jumper's burning vengeance. Now he's in a race against time to stop an unrelenting evil unleashed upon the earth. And if he's to protect his family and the world, he must breach the tenuous boundary between life and death to confront a killer and a shocking secret from his long buried past. Now, I think I've probably used every cliche a writer's ever used in that blurb, from deadly chain of events to race against time, shocking secrets, but it's all in there. And there's lots of twists and turns. There's lots of action. There's some traditional horror and scary things, and there's a nice little surprise twist at the end.
All right, awesome. Yeah, I mean, writing a blurb's a difficult thing, and you want to hit all the marks so people know what to expect. But like you said, you know, it's like, is it going to be always going to be original? Does it always need to be original as far as just the blurb goes? I mean, I'm sure there's enough originality in your story there, even when you pare it down to just a blurb.
Yeah,
got a lot going on.
You know, I had worked with my editor for a long time on this because, I mean, it has to be the thing that catches people's attention. And, you know, you read hundreds of these things and you work on yours and it just changes. And eventually it's just like, aha, I think I've got it. Mm-hmm. But it's like writing the book itself. It probably took just as long. So it's kind of interesting process.
Yeah, there are people that specialize in just writing blurbs. I'm not one of them, despite the name of my show. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the series. I mean, the title of your book.
So A Taker of Morrows. I had originally, I'm not really good with titles. I was working with kind of a working title for a while, something that I had called Jumper. And of course, you know, the story has caretakers and jumpers, and these jumpers are, again, the evil kind of spirits that try to interact with humans and kill them. So I thought that was an interesting title. But when I had an agent for a very short time. She eventually became my editor. But when I was with this agency, they were very adamant about making sure that you never picked a title that someone else had done. So when someone types in your book, they get you. They don't get anyone else. And so Jumper had been done. And Jumper was a film. So I started to scramble. I'm like, what am I going to choose? And there's another character in our book called the Burning Man, and he's this, the nemesis to my protagonist. But of course, the Burning Man was taken. Philip Margolin had a classic book called The Burning Man, and there's like 8 other Burning Mans, by the way. So that was out. So we were done with this book, and we were ready to start pitching it, and we had no title. So kind of as a last resort, my editor, my agent at that time, went to this online, I guess they have these title generators where you can type in some things about your book, some characters, some names, some things, and they'll like spit out, and then you press like your genre, horror or thriller, and they'll spit out a title for you. So we tried this, and there was just nothing there. We scrolled through them, and they were just ridiculous mishmashes of words. And the last one was A Taker of Morrows. And it struck me because it was perfect. Morrow is like an old English word for tomorrow. So a taker of morrows would be, someone who takes the tomorrows from somebody. And we also have a character in the book named Morrow, who's the caretaker of the protagonist. So a taker of morrows would be this, entity that was stealing his charge or his protectee. So it was like on dual levels, it worked perfectly. So, at the end of the day, we used some online thing to come up with a title that I think really is a grabber. So I was very pleased with that.
Wow, that's quite a story. I mean, I know it's nearly impossible to come up with an original title. You're right, and for search engine reasons and other things, it's great if you can. But
right.
You managed to do that, and in such a random way that it worked out so perfectly. It is a good name, and to hear how it fits in with your story, that's great.
Yeah, and you don't really know that as you pick up the book, but you get that as the story goes on. I don't really give anything away there, but it's sort of, there's a dual meaning to the title that worked out really well for us. So very pleased, and I don't see anyone who's ever going to use that title again. So that works.
Cool. Is this a standalone book, or is it part of a series?
No, it's part of a trilogy. There's the second book. The second book I have out already, which is called The Soul Dweller. That's book 2 in the series, and I'm completing the third as we go. I'm kind of torn with, is it going to be more than 3 books? Are we going to, continue it on? I know there's a lot of long series out there, and sometimes I think they get a little stale, although a lot of people really like series. They want to keep going with it. So I'm in a little bit of a quandary writing the third one, whether I want to tie everything up or whether I want to keep it going. So I think I'll leave it a little bit open-ended and just see where it goes. So it's part of a trilogy, what we call it the Caretakers series.
Okay, great. Of course, there's always the option of spinning off something and having a new series. So you have a new number 1, but there's still a tie-in to get people drawn over from the original series.
Yeah, no, and that's true. There's sort of an ensemble cast in these books of a number of characters that people have informed me that they really like, and they really like certain ones. And it would be kind of neat to spin that off. I've thought about that. But I'm also kind of thinking about some other standalone ideas that I have. And it would be, so what do? Do you just continue writing your series, or do you pursue other things? I think it's really difficult to write 2 books at the same time. So we'll just see where it goes. It's a lot of fun right now. I'm enjoying it quite a bit.
That's great. We just saw the cover to your book. Could you talk a little bit about what went into that?
Yeah, I really like the cover. I found an artist or Hydra Publications found an artist after I made some recommendations. It's a guy from Warren Design, and he did both of the covers for A Taker of Morrows and The Soul Dweller. I was really adamant about finding something that was original art for the cover, and Hydra was really great about working with me on that. I had actually run into a book cover where I saw an image that was the same image for a second book, 2 different authors, and I just thought, oh, that's not the thing. I do not want that to happen. And there's so many stock images out there that people are using. and there's so many pre-made covers that are so similar, and sometimes they're the same. So it was really important to work with an artist that was going to come up with a concept for the cover. And so this was kind of my first cover. I never really knew how to do it, and I gave them all sorts of ideas. And finally, this guy was like, just step back a little bit, let me do what I do. And he came up with something great. And that kind of that shadow man on the cover has become the logo that we're using for almost everything. It's on my website, it's on my cards, it's on every chapter page. So for every chapter, we have a little image, and we have that guy on the stairs. And I think it's a real, it's gonna be the kind of the iconic figure for the series. And we're using in the second book too, on all the chapter pages. So I love it. I've had a lot of great feedback on the cover. People have, unsolicited, responses about how much they love the cover. So I think I've found the artist, and I actually contacted him recently, even though I'm not done with the book yet. I didn't want to lose him. So I said, are you ready to do a cover? And he's ready. So as long as I get that third cover, it doesn't matter when I finish the book. So
That's right. Yeah, I talked to a lot of other artists that have authors that have cover artists that become popular, and then they have trouble getting the cover they need on the schedule they need. It's
right.
Tough.
Right. And I had a little trouble with him on the second book because he was busy for quite a while. And I was sort of begging, please just do one more and I won't bother you. But I bothered him a third time. So he's happy to do it. He has a little free time. So,
yeah. All right, great. So obviously there's a horror element. What genre would a reader find this under?
Yeah, it would be, it's under horror, and horror is this huge umbrella, I think. It covers a lot of things. It covers supernatural thrillers and even paranormal in some ways. I would say this book is a supernatural thriller. There's no slasher kind of horror stuff in it. There are elements of horror. Elements of traditional horror, but there's no cabin in the woods, there's no teens, there's no haunted house. When I think of this book, I think more of the kind of the Stephen King-ish genre, and I use his name reverently because I don't want to, make any jumps there. But I think about Stephen King books, and even though he's called the master of horror, if you think about his books like Green Mile, or even ones like Dead Zone, it's not really straight horror. It's more supernatural. So, my book is really about the ongoing soul journey, the eternal price we pay for what we carry in our souls. It's about the bond between fathers and sons. That's a huge theme in this. And, how love can kind of transcend these tenuous boundaries between life and death. So it's more than just horror. So, but it's going to be under that category.
Mm-hmm. Do you see yourself writing in any other categories, any other genres?
I would, I don't know. Horror has always been, and that whole umbrella of horror has been really important in my life, from the movies that my brothers and I used to watch back in the 70s, these terrible movies like It's Alive and all these, The Manitou, all these crazy like 70s. We were just so into horror as a genre. And then when I discovered Stephen King as a writer, it sort of changed, how I think about that. So I would say I'd always be in that genre. I experimented a little bit in the second book, The Soul Dweller, with doing a little bit of historical fiction. In my novels, there's portals to different worlds and different times, and there's a little bit of a time travel element, a time loop that was developed, and the main characters kind of go back to 1946 Plymouth, Massachusetts. And so writing in that style was really cool, and thinking about what Plymouth looked like in 1946 and how people were, and I enjoyed that quite a bit. But I think, and I actually have an idea for a historical fiction novel later on, which will have horror elements too. So that would be something I would consider, is kind of doing historical fiction.
Okay. Now for one of my favorite questions, which is the elevator pitch. If you had to compare this, what meets what?
Yeah, that's the big one. And so I would say it's Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest meets Stranger Things with a little bit of Twilight Zone thrown in. All right, so that's a lot to take in, but it's a story about a guy who finds out that the world isn't exactly what he thought it was. It's a battleground between the forces of good and evil, a place where caretakers, protect earthly souls, and jumpers hunt them as prey. And now he's become the prey. So I see the North by Northwest sort of part of this, and it's a little bit of an obscure reference, although it's one of the greatest films of all time. A lot of people may not know it, but it's it's a regular guy getting thrown into a very irregular circumstance. And in the film, Cary Grant's this ad man, and he becomes involved in this international espionage. He's suspected of murder, and it's like there's no way out. There's a no-win situation. How is he going to get out of this? And I think a lot of Hitchcock is like that. So I like that element of it, and I have that in my book. I have my main character is being hunted by this supernatural killer from the afterlife. He's on the run from law enforcement for 2 murders he didn't commit. It's a no-win situation. How's he going to get out of it? There's no way out. So there's that Hitchcock aspect. I think the Stranger Things is that supernatural element. There's that movement into different portals and the upside down and kind of going into different worlds. And I have different levels, existential kind of places that people can move through portals. So I think there's an element there. And then you throw in Twilight Zone. Why'd you do that? Well, Twilight Zone, there's a little bit of crazy in it too. So I think I read an interesting quote from a writer who said that every science fiction and horror book that he's ever read has elements of the Twilight Zone series in it. And I think that's true. I recently just finished up watching every single Twilight Zone episode with my son. And we did this over the course of a couple of years because there's a ton of them. And even though I think it ran for 4 or 5 years, the first season there was like something like 36 episodes. And, today you get, 10 or 15 and it's a pretty big deal. 36 episodes. And so we went through every single one of them. And every time I'd see one, I'm like, oh, that's that movie. I know where they got that from. So anyway, I threw in Twilight Zone because it's kind of interesting. And there's some things that go into the book that are a little Twilight Zone-y.
Now that you're done with Twilight Zone, you need to watch Night Gallery.
I remember that. I watched that when I was a kid. I remember parts of that. So yeah, I was pretty young though.
So what got the ball rolling on this series? Why this particular book?
Well, the impetus behind this was my daughter. My daughter Kaylee is 18 years old, but when I started writing, she was 13 or 14, and she had already written. Actually, at 18, she has an 80,000 word book written, and it's really amazing. And I was reading part of it. I remember she had showed me part of it 4 or 5 years ago before I really started writing. Now, I had some experience in writing, grant writing and research papers and things like that. I'm a university professor, and I do a lot of that. So I had 20 years of writing, but not writing fiction. And I read her stuff, and I couldn't believe how good it was for a 14, 15-year-old girl to be writing this stuff. And I told her, I said, this is a real talent. I said, people just can't do this. And I said, no, I couldn't do this. And she said, but, you should try. You should try to do it. And I thought, all right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a book for my daughter. I'm going to write this little book. It'll be 40,000 words. I'll give it to her for Christmas. I'll have it bound, and that'll be the end of it. And so I started writing this book, and like I am with things, I kind of got into it, and I started to take it very seriously, and I started to go to some writing conferences to learn a little bit more about writing. I had kind of a moment, kind of an epiphany moment where I wrote a chapter, and I sat back, and not arrogantly, but I thought, I can do this. I think I can do this. I think I can write a real book. And so it kind of took on a life of its own. I started to get some other people involved reading it. I have a brother who lives in New York City who's written or has, I think, read every book that's ever been written, one of the most intelligent people I've ever met. Great reader. And I let him read it, and I said, just let me know what you think. And he liked it. And so that was an impetus to kind of to move forward with it and try to get it published. But at the end of the day, it was really for my daughter. And we, you know, we share a really unique bond in that we both write, we share chapters, we talk about plot, you know. It's really kind of a cool relationship that I think will go on for many years. Just this little piece that we have together. So she was the spark. She's what started it. I definitely would not have put pen to paper without her. So she helped me discover this passion that was sort of inside that I didn't really realize I had.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Hey, when doing research for the book, did you learn anything surprising?
Yeah, research is interesting. I that's what actually I do at the university. I am a researcher, and I don't I mean, I like it. It's what I do. But when I write, and horror kind of gives you a little bit of leeway to not have to do a lot of research. You know, if I was doing something about some thriller about Washington and the CIA and black ops and those kind of things, I'd have to do endless amounts of research. And so I'm kind of happy I'm in the horror realm a little bit. But I did have to do a lot of research into police procedures, interrogations, and things that come up in my book. You know, firearms. I had an interesting piece where I looked into radio frequency ID tags that are in cars that are part of these transponders that, you know, when you go through a toll booth, you don't have to pay anymore. It just kind of bills you for these things. Or if you're on the highway and you see, 15 miles, 15 minutes, all of these tags are in our vehicles now, and they can monitor traffic. They can monitor, they can deduct from your bank account, but they can also tell where you've been and that's really interesting. And so that was an element of this story which I learned something about. I didn't know we could be kind of surveilled at all times where our cars are going. The fun thing about this book was researching the settings, which the book is set on Cape Cod. It's a place I grew up. It's a place I spend my summers. And the place is very, it's dear to me. And I wanted to write books set in that region. I remember growing up always wanting to read a book about Cape Cod or a thriller in Cape Cod, and I never really found one. And so I wanted to do that. And I know the area very well, but I had a lot of fun going to very specific places and very specific towns and streets and using local businesses, even imagining where the house would be on a certain street and describing it that way. One of the portals to the next world in this book is a place called the Pancake Man. It's a restaurant on Cape Cod that used to be a chain across Cape Cod. There's now one left. So I sort of honored it in this as the portal to this next world that one of my lead characters uses to get there. So there's a very real element to it that I like. I will mention in the second book, The Soul Dweller, it's set in Plymouth, and I also spend my summers there. I have a house there, and my family goes there. And I was in the cemetery in Plymouth, which is called Burial Hill, and it's one of the oldest oldest cemeteries in the country. It's a place where William Bradford, John Carver, these pilgrims are actually buried, and they have these amazing epitaphs. And there's a specific epitaph I ran across in that cemetery that dictates how the book goes. There's something written on that epitaph that directed the characters to something, and it felt very organic. It felt very real to me. So in research, that wasn't actually research, but it became sort of research. And then I started researching all these epitaphs, which I use as chapter headings in each of the chapters in the second book. So that was kind of cool.
Yeah, that's really neat. And that's cool. A little bit of real history involved there.
Yeah.
Um, so, avoiding too many spoilers, why don't you tell us a little bit about your main character or characters?
Okay. Yeah, I have one, obviously one protagonist, but I sort of have a second one, and I'll have to introduce them together. They're a husband and wife team that kind of work together to solve these supernatural occurrences. It's really about a guy named Robert Granville, RG for short, and he's a college professor. He's got a child on the way. He has a good life. Comes home from work one night to find this stranger in his living room, and the stranger is actually his caretaker and this protector, this guardian that he's had his whole life. Now, he doesn't know, because these caretakers they're kind of like guardian angels. They're invisible. You don't know they're there. But this one has presented himself to him, and you'll learn his motivations later. But he tells him that he's got 24 hours to live, and that there's this vengeful jumper from the next world that is hunting him. And so he's presented with a little bit of a conundrum, because his wife, Casey, this sort of protagonist 1A, has these otherworldly powers. She's had them since she was a child. She can sort of see things in her dreams and see the future and actually change the future. She's created this portal in her mind that she can go to the next world through this portal, and she can take people with her. And these dormant sort of otherworldly powers start to emerge in her. And so RG's conundrum is whether she would form they'd be a formidable team against this Burning Man, who is the nemesis of my main character. They'd be quite a formidable team, but his conundrum is she's 7 months pregnant. If he gets her involved in this, he puts her at risk. He puts his unborn child at risk. But if he doesn't, there's no way he's going to defeat this supernatural serial killer from the next world. So that sort of sets the stage for the story. So those are my main characters. I've got kind of this sad sack cop who is Casey's ex-lover. So that creates a little tension in the book and kind of creates a nice dynamic among the big three. So those are like my big three characters.
Well, sounds pretty interesting there. Okay, another of my favorite questions, dream casting. Now, have you thought any about who you would cast as any of these characters if you had the choice?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny, we were out to dinner the other night, and I was thinking about this, and we started talking around the table of, who would it be? Would it be Jake Gyllenhaal? Would it be, I don't know. We went through a number of people, for the lead character, but my son came up with Paul Rudd. I don't know if you know, Paul Rudd I guess he just saw Ant-Man or something. I think he's in Ant-Man,
yeah.
But he's also in some like The Anchorman and some other comedies. And he was perfect because he's got this kind face. He's kind of got a great sense of humor. He's likable. It's Paul Rudd. It's, R.G. Granville is Paul Rudd. So we're going to have to hire him or call him when the time comes. For Casey, his wife, we were thinking Amy Adams, because she's just great. And maybe for the sad sack police officer, I had Mark Wahlberg in mind. But I know Mark Wahlberg would never go second billing. We couldn't afford him anyway. So I don't think that's going to happen. But those are my three.
All right. Well, that sounds like an interesting cast.
And one of the things I think is interesting about that is when I write, I really had and this is why I thought about this question for quite a while, because I never think about the character as anyone else but someone that's just invented in my mind. Mm-hmm. And I read a lot of books where people describe characters, I think, too much, and they even use, popular culture to kind of make you want to know what they look like. Mm-hmm. And I like when you don't know what they look like, when you think of it yourself and kind of envision your own imagination of what that author is. And, you can describe them in a number of ways that people, like a weary complexion, or, you could use a lot of things where it just leaves it up to the reader to figure that out. So I like that very much. But I guess at some point, if you're going to go movies, there has to be somebody who plays it. So.
Well, it's funny because a lot of authors, they cast it in their mind before they put pen to paper, and then a lot of them never think about it. So I think it's an interesting question to ask.
Yeah. Oh, it's a great question. Yeah.
And a new question I've started asking is a soundtrack. Did you have any particular thing that you listened to, or a song that reminds you of the story or the characters or anything like that?
I wouldn't say a soundtrack, especially to the first book, probably not. I was trying to experiment a little bit in the writing with using some lyrics or some references to songs. I'd read a number of books where they did it really well, including some Stephen King books where he used, even to introduce chapters, he had lyrics of songs, and it went really well with what he was talking about. One of the opening series where you first meet my lead character, I talk about him, listening to Warren Zevon on ZLX, going down 90, Interstate 90. But it took me a week to figure out the artist. And I was like, I'm not going to do this. It's just too much. So I tried to stay away from that. The second book, The Soul Dweller, however, I have a character, another caretaker that comes into this story who's totally stuck in the 70s. I mean, he wears like the John Travolta suit and kind of has the blow-dried long locks and the shirt unbuttoned to his chest. And he is an ABBA fan. And, tears come to his eyes when an ABBA song comes on. So there's a little lighthearted piece of this second book. But yeah, I think for the second book, there'd be a number of ABBA songs that would be part of that soundtrack.
All right. Fans of what other author or book series do you think would enjoy your book?
Well, I think because it falls under that supernatural category under horror, I would, readers of, Stephen King, Dean Koontz. I mean, these are the legends. But still, I think I've tried to craft my writing in that way. Douglas Clegg is another author who does some great supernatural stuff. There's a series by Katie Munger who did something called the Dead Detective series. And it was a real cool series about this detective who was killed in the line of duty, but he'd been an alcoholic. He'd been just a kind of an all-around bad guy. But when he died, he kind of figured out his life's purpose. And he kind of comes back and helps with these cases. And it was really kind of cool to have this entity from the next world kind of, that I see a parallel to what I've written. Other really good books that I've read in the last couple of years, fans of J. Lincoln Fenn's Dead Souls, which was kind of a book about a support group of people who accidentally sold their soul to the devil, which is just a fantastic premise and a really good book. Fans of Sonia Condit's Starter House, which was another cool horror novel. So people in that genre, I think, would really like A Taker of Morrows and The Soul Dweller.
Now, I know you came into writing, kind of fiction writing, kind of late. But who would you say influenced you or inspired you, other than your daughter, obviously?
Well, I wasn't a writer until late, but I was a reader my whole life, and I started really early. And I started with the Edgar Rice Burroughs science fiction novels, the Venus series, the Mars series. Carson Napier Goes to Venus, and John Carter and the Mars series. So 6 or 7 books in each of those series. But he also had a bunch of standalones, the Moon Men, just a whole bunch of these titles. And I used to read them when I was really young, 10, 11 years old. And I would pick them up. Again, Cape Cod seems to be this connection to this start of the reading too, because I guess I was in school during the year. I wasn't reading a lot of fiction, but when I'd get there in the summer, I'd go to these bookstores. And back then, the Edgar Rice Burroughs books had these covers that were the art by Frank Frazetta. I don't know if you've seen that art. It's amazing. And they just jumped off the book stand to me. And I must have read 20 or 30 of these Edgar Rice Burroughs books. And I just couldn't put them down. So that was really the start. That's when I really knew that reading was something that was going to, had sort of captured my attention and would for the rest of my life. But it was when I read Salem's Lot, when I read Stephen King's Salem's Lot, and actually saw the series on television. But when I read that book, that changed everything. I think about it, it must be like, when the Beatles came on, in the early 60s, and the music scene just changed. Like for me, the reading changed when Stephen King came on board. And that just took it to a different level. So he's been the biggest inspiration in my reading world, as well as the writing. And when I started writing, I feel like everything I'd learned, from all the reading I had done had really found a place to go. But he was the guy.
All right. Do you have any time to read now? Is there anyone in particular you're reading these days?
Yeah, well, I still try to read Stephen King as much as I can. I read Joe Hill now, which is his son, and he's a nice. I really like his stuff. Although recently I had the chance to buy Nosferatu for like $1.99 on BookBub on Amazon, and I didn't, because it was like 700 pages, and I was like, "There's no way, I just can't do it. I can't read those 1,000-page Stephen King or 700-page books anymore." But I've liked Joe Hill's stuff. I've liked Horns, and I've liked Heart-Shaped Box. I enjoyed quite a bit. Paul Tremblay is another horror guy that I like. Head Full of Ghosts was one of the best books in the last 5 years. Peter Straub is kind of in that Stephen King genre. Ghost Story was one of the greatest books I've ever read, and all of his books have been great. So I still keep an eye on them. Some of the newer ones, I'm actually reading Let the Right One In, which is John Ajvide Lindquist. It's an older book, but it's a classic, and I'd seen the films, and I really wanted to read the book because it's really good. I know you're supposed to read in your genre, and I do. I read in the horror genre, but I like to get out of the genre too. One of my favorite series is the Randy Wayne White series. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's about this kind of mild-mannered marine biologist who lives in Sanibel Island, and he's surrounded by this eclectic group of friends, but he's really the CIA operative, and he gets called onto these missions, and he kicks ass, and then he goes back to his little world, and it's just kind of cool. There's like 14 or 15 of these books, and every year there's a new one, and I definitely read those. And so I try to read as much as I can, but the writing does get in the way, because you want to write, and every night I want to write and get some things down, but you have to balance that.
Mm-hmm. And along those lines, anything in particular that you're like, I know you said you watched all the Twilight Zones, but anything you're binge watching or any, shows you're into right now?
I say this, I should be watching more. I just don't have a lot of time to do it. And, working at the university, then coming home and, being with the family, and then wanting to write is really what I want to do at night. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things I have, I think I'll get to, but I don't know. I've found that freeing up or getting away from the television frees up so much time to be creative, if that's what you want to do. Mm-hmm. And that's what I want to do right now. So yeah, there's nothing really going on right now in terms of series that I'm involved in. I sometimes, when I do, go to a movie or see something, I get so involved in like watching their plot points and what they're doing. I almost can't enjoy it because I'm thinking about how the story's going, how they're pacing it. So I don't know, that maybe that's just that's what happens when you get involved in that. So.
Yeah, I've got the same problem. I listen to a lot of audiobooks since I don't have a lot of time to sit and read. And when I do, I'll find myself wandering. It'll spawn some idea for my story, and I'll be like, wait a minute, I got to stop. I can't let the story continue on while I'm not paying attention. I got to put that on hold for a minute so I can get my head straight and get back into the story again.
Yeah, and I had done a few what they called books on tape a long time ago. Mm-hmm. I had done long vacations going on cars and like listening to books. I thought it was amazing. I haven't got into that sort of because I feel like it's cheating, but I know it's actually a good choice if you can't find the time to read. My commute's so short, though. It's like I just get 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there. It's but we do some trips. We do go, across the country to the Cape every year. So that might be the time to start pulling out some Audible, and doing that.
Cool. And once again, I know you don't have a lot of time because you're really busy, but do you have any strange or unusual hobbies?
I think my wife thinks writing is, but it's way more than a hobby. But other than that, no, I don't. I sort of collected guitars for a while. My wife put it into that too. I was starting to spend too much of the family money on those things. So I've got that collection is over. No, I don't really have any strange hobbies.
All right. And then if you had one piece of advice to share to an aspiring writer, what do you think it would be? I know it's a tough question, but
it is a tough question. Writing is such a strange thing. We construct these images and emotions that aren't present in people's heads until we put them there. And then sort of we let them wander around in our own minds. And kind of show them things, and it's a little strange to do that. And I think when we do that, we open ourselves up to a lot of pain with like rejection. So anytime you submit something, there's going to be a lot of people who don't like it. It's such a subjective thing. But I guess my advice would be to prepare for a lot of rejections. And accept it. And sometimes I think the difference between, the writers or the authors that put themselves in position for one more rejection are often the writers that get published because they put themselves out there. And I heard an interesting podcast from a writer, and his name is escaping me, but he says he judges his success on the number of rejections he gets every year, because he's putting himself out there fearlessly to be rejected. And, it's just a matter of time before someone finds and likes your work. So I guess my advice would be to let it all out, let everyone see what you're doing, and just be ready for those rejections, because they're going to come, but with them will come some acceptances too.
Cool. So you're currently working on book 3 of the series?
Yeah.
And the series, once again, the series title was?
The Caretakers.
The Caretakers.
Yeah.
All right. And so book 1 and 2 are available. And there are ebook and print editions, right?
That's true. And it looks like the audiobook will be out at some point, where I guess they're auditioning actors for the role right now. So that's all good news.
All right, that's great. I'm a big audiobook fan, so I like hearing that. So I had to add that to my wish list.
Yeah, I'll send you one.
All right, that'd be awesome. All right, and do you have a website you'd like to send people to, or?
Yeah, so my website is www.stephenpaulsayers.com. That's Stephen with a PH. Paul Sayers is Sayers, and that's kind of the starting point. All my books are listed there with their Amazon listings. I have some short stories you can download. I've got movie reviews of my top 10 favorite horror films. And I've got book reviews. I've got reviews from some of the recent books that I've read, even some outside the genre. So there's a lot of stuff to play around with. I would recommend you go take a look and see what you think. All
right, that's awesome. Nice to know there's a lot of content there. So
trying to keep it interesting.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, it's been great having you on here. I'm really looking forward to hearing your audiobook.
Yeah, and I appreciate the time. Thanks for having me.
I'd like to thank author Stephen Paul Sayers for being our guest, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. Be sure to visit theblurb.tv for all the links mentioned in the episode. And if you enjoyed the program, be sure to share this with your friends. And remember to hit like and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. You can follow us on YouTube, Twitter, and iTunes. You can support the show by visiting our sponsors, buying our merch, or shopping with our affiliate links. And as always, thanks for your support, and I'll see you next week with an all-new episode.